Assalamualaikum and hi. My name is Muhammad Fakhri bin Muhamad Apandi, matrix number 055615, and I'm from band 6B. So for this textual analysis task, my groupmate and I has chosen the short story known as The Dog and Its Reflection. For the introduction, The Dog and Its Reflection is one of the Aesop Fables stories. The story is also known as The Dog and Its Shadows in the later version, and is numbered as 133 in the Perry Index. Perry Index is an index given for the Aesop Fables stories. The story is one of the Aesop Fables' most famous story and has already been adapted to many other cultures and languages. Aesop Fables is the world's best-known collection of morality fables written by a former Greek slave Aesop in the late to mid-6th century before century. This story came with a lesson of being satisfied with what the one had and not to sacrifice it for the other thing. For example, in the story, which is the shadows. Finally, the fables highlight one of humanity's oldest characteristics, which is storytelling. For the synopsis of The Dog and Its Reflection, according to the original version of the story, which is Aesop Fables, the story was about a dog that managed to obtain a bone from a butcher. The dog then hurriedly ran as fast as it could to its home in order to savor it. As it was crossing a narrow bridge, it saw its reflection in the water and thought it was another dog that also carried a bone, a much bigger one. Then the dog became very greedy and wanted the other bone for itself. Then, without any thought, it dropped his bone and sprang onto the dog in the water, only to find itself swimming for its dear life in the water. Fortunately, it managed to come out of the water. After that, it thought of how foolish it is to drop its bone and go for its reflection because of its greed.
Thank you, Fakhri, for the presentation on the introduction and synopsis of the fable. Hello everyone, my name is Muhammad Arfan Ehsan, matrix number 056171, and I will continue on the presentation on the textual analysis of the fable The Dog and His Reflection. So first of all, when analyzing the translated Malay version of the short story, there seems to be many techniques of translation used. Although so, it seemed that in the translated Malay version called Anjing dengan Bayang, the author utilizes more of the oblique techniques of translation rather than the direct technique. So in saying this, our textual analysis of the short story will be more focused on the oblique technique used by the author. So the first technique that was used to translate the fable was the adaptation technique. The adaptation technique refers to the process of adapting to a scenario from the source language to the targeted language, and in this case from the English language to the Malay language, and in doing so it will still convey the same message. So for example, in the English version of the fable, the sentence "a dog to whom the butcher had thrown a bone was hurrying home with his prize" is translated to "anjing berasa sangat bertuah kerana mendapat seketul tulang besar dari pasar." As can be seen, the situation in both versions of the story is different. The dog receives the bone from a butcher in the English version. Meanwhile, in the Malay version, the dog obtained the bone from the market. The author utilizes the adaptation technique by changing that. This is because in Malaysia, we are more connected to the market, or pasar as we call it in Malaysia. And we often see animals obtain food leftovers from the market. So the situation can be much more recognizable for Malaysians when reading the Malay version of the fable. And while the usage of the term penjual daging can be used, the word pasar is also very much relevant.
Thank you, Arfan. Hi everyone, my name is Muhamad Salim bin Muhammad Noor, matrix number 055853. The second technique used by the translator is modulation technique. Modulation technique is a translation that involves departing from the standard structure of the phrase as well as the standard viewpoint or experience. According to Molina, the technique of modulation involves shifting either the point of view, the focal point, or the cognitive category in respect to the phrase. From the table, we can see that the situations are described differently from one another. In the English version, the scenario of the dog's mental process is described in much more straightforward manner, while the Malay version use quotations that is meant to be the thought process inside the mind of the dog. This method of translation may have been used by the translator to enhance the reading experience for youngsters, especially they are the intended audience for this type of short story. The third translation technique used by the translator is transposition technique. Transposition technique is the process of changing one word class for another without changing the meaning of the text. The words used by the Malay translator to describe the feeling of the dog after the incident based on the text in the table are different from the source text. In the English version, it uses the word stupid, which means bodoh in Malay, to describe the dog's feeling, while the Malay version uses the word penyesalan, which means regret in English. The word penyesalan used by the translator is a noun, and according to Merriam-Webster, regret noun means an expression of unpleasant emotion. Realizing stupidness is an action of regret because it is an unpleasant emotion, and the feeling of regret is caused by the unpleasant emotion, which is stupidness. Even though the word used to describe the feeling of the dog have completely different meanings, the usage of the word in the sentence delivers the same exact meaning, and this is the transposition technique.
So thank you to the previous presenter. So now I'm going to share about our review and thoughts about the whole overall process of translation for this assessment. So we found it quite confusing to assess this document because we couldn't find any direct translations at all. So we highlighted 3 oblique techniques, which are adaptations, modulation, and transposition. So first and foremost, the technique of modulation. It was implemented excellently. So even though we could see that a dialogue format was being used to describe the greediness of the dog in the Malay translation, rather than a straightforward statement, it still conveyed the same meaning to the English version. The readers can clearly understand the dog is being super envious towards the other dog, which was indeed his own reflection. Next, we identified that the transposition translation technique was also executed perfectly. The translator has described the dog's feelings after going through a very horrific situation in a such similar manner, which is the realization. In both languages, feelings of sadness and misery were very well described. Hence, the meaning of the message stayed the same. But if there's one area that we would like to improve, it is the adaptation technique. So the setting in the English version was far too different from the Malay version. The word butcher, which is penjual daging in Malay, was not mentioned in the Malay version. For the Malay translation, the situation was described to take place in a pasar or market instead. It is probably due to the fact that the Malay audience might be more familiar with the word market rather than the word butcher. Therefore, the translator had to adapt to the circumstances. So, if we could improve it, we would still try to describe what is butcher in Malay, thus changing the translation process into modulation instead.
In the nutshell, the dog and its reflection is a very famous story of the Aesop fable, even in the Bahasa Melayu version. When comparing both of the story in English and Bahasa Melayu, we managed to identify 3 translation techniques used to translate the story, which are adaptation, modulation, and transposition technique. These translation techniques are used to make sure that the story is still relevant and fun even when translated into Bahasa Melayu. That's all from our group. Thank you.